This is Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis, and I'm hosting the fourth hour of the Alex Jones Show. Welcome back. You know, I thought today we would talk about some philosophical and spiritual topics at the same time. I want to talk about nihilism, the philosophy of our age. And I'm going to tell you what nihilism is, and we're going to talk about a book that's really good on this, that's really brief. But I remember many years ago, about 20 years ago, I went to this country church out in the middle of nowhere. I remember this preacher stood up and he had that Georgia judge, like a Southern judge drawl. You know, he said, we've got people out here in the country of America, God's nation, and they are erecting altars to Lucifer, to the devil. And we're going to see more of this, erecting altars to, and probably even worse, right? And it just poured out like sap, right? Like molasses coming out of that whatever tree molasses comes out of, the molasses tree. And I remember sitting in the crowd and I was thinking, this is crazy. What? I was, 21-year-old wild boy. I thought, what is this? This is crazy. There's not going to be altars to the devil, and this is nonsense. And then here we are, 20 years later, 2020, and we've got open groups out there openly erecting altars to the devil in America, you see. So I have to give props to that old country preacher. He was actually right about some things 20 years ago. I mentioned a book. This book is called Nihilism, and it's written by an Orthodox philosopher, and his name is Seraphim Rose, and he wanted to analyze what he thought was the zeitgeist, okay, not that goofy movie, the spirit of the time, right, the zeitgeist of our era. And he thought that you could trace it back to these kind of Jacobin revolutionaries. You've heard Alex mention, Jacobins, Illuminati, this kind of stuff. And there's absolutely documented evidence and proof of this when you go and read these philosophers' actual writings. I had a professor who specialized in that in my undergrad. And we actually went in, we actually read, a lot of these original manuscripts and texts from these guys. The official history, a lot of it's actually public too. It's not like people think, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. No, actually, there's a wealth of information in mainline scholars about, the Bavarian Illuminati and this kind of stuff. Anyway, it's this radical revolutionary philosophy that was even wilder, than anything else that we saw in, the American Revolution or anything like that. They were like the communists of their time. And as I mentioned in past segments with Alex, they were influenced by Plato's Republic, right? Well, what happens with this radical revolutionary philosophy is the idea that we don't want kings, we don't want none of that stuff, we don't want democracy. Who's going to run all the stuff, right? Who's going to be the big boy, the big chief at the top of the totem pole running things in society? Well, we need philosopher kings. And shocker, who do you think Plato put at the top of running everything? The philosopher as the king, right? So if we have philosopher kings, the idea runs, then everything will function logically. It'll be ideal, right? Plato said what we got to do is pick out elite kids from the guardian class, which is the communist class on the Platonic pyramid there. There's three tiers to the Plato pyramid. You got the proletariat worker masses, and then you got the guardian class of communist soldiers, and then at the top you got the philosopher king elite. And Plato thought we could draw out of the lower classes somebody, take them, stick them on a mountain for about 30 years, make them do a bunch of math homework, literally just sitting up there doing math homework, studying geometry. And then you come down the mountain, right? Plato's not a guru in the sense of like a yogi rolling around in filth. Plato thought you come down from the mountain and then you take all that math and you stamp it into the city-state. You force the city-state into this perfect ideal republic as best you can, right? There's always going to be players, hustlers, right? There's always going to be black ops. You can never get rid of everything bad. Plato wasn't an idealist in the sense that he thought you would actually get this perfect society, but he did think that you could shoot for it, right? So this elite philosopher guy comes down after studying, and then he's got to stamp onto society, onto the city-state, this mathematical ideal. Now, what do you think might come out of that? Mathematics, techne. The Greeks talked a lot about techne. Technocracy, you see. It originates in the ancient Greeks, right, in Platonism. Now, on paper, this sounds good, right? If you're got a little dose of tism, right, got a little dose of that TISM, then you might think, oh, that's perfect. Why don't we all do that? Yes, let's have me, the king autist, as the head of the society, and I'll run everything perfectly. But if you know about that, you can't have a Spurg society. You can't have a Spurg empire, because the world doesn't work on the ideals, right? The world works on reality, and reality is in flux. Reality is not perfect, right? There are ideals that we can shoot for, yeah. But every one of the utopian communist type societies, from revolutionary France and the Jacobins, all the way up to any of the revolutions the last few centuries that tried to enact these utopias. The problem is that they didn't take into account the real world, right? That you can't stamp into a world that is in the process of change a perfect ideal. But if you're young and dumb, you can convince a bunch of young dummies that you can do that, you see, right? So that's the danger in this philosophy. The danger is that it dupes young people. When you're young, you're idealistic, right? You think, I'm going to change the world, right? I'm going to be the king Spurg, and I'm going to be the god emperor, the Kwisatz Haderach, right? I'm going to be Paul Muad'Dib. But it doesn't work that way, because the world is more complex than you think when you're 18, 19, 20, and you're brought into that kind of Maoist youth brigade type of stuff, which the universities absolutely teach. I dealt with this for years when I was in the university system, all these sort of crazed professors. But the point here is that there's a philosophy that results from this attempt to constantly try to set up this perfect utopia. And what it leads to, and ironically, Plato even kind of picked up on this, is chaos, anarchy, right? And that leads to nihilism. And in Father Rose's philosophy, he actually assigns stages to this, which I'll get into here in a minute. But basically, nihilism is the philosophy that there's not really any philosophy, right? It's in a way, it's Nietzschean. Nietzsche is kind of a nihilistic philosopher par excellence, which is not to say that there's no philosophy or that there's no, quote, truth, but it becomes a rebellion against truth. And we're going to see some of these crazed characters of the 20th century who are nihilistic, like Lenin, right? Lenin actually thought, Lenin would say stuff like, I want to blow up the universe. like you thought, ISIS or something was a terror group. I mean, nobody could top Lenin. Lenin wanted to blow up the whole damn universe, right? So if we think about these basic principles and we think about how the ideals that people wanted to set up, when they fail, they lead people to these radical, crazy positions, nihilism. Now, again, there's a lot of professors and philosophers out there who are nihilists who will say, oh, you're misinterpreting, we don't think that you need to blow up everything. Now, that's just one stage of nihilism. That's what I'm getting at here, right? Because there's a dark logic to these kind of atheistic philosophies that leads people into more and more consistency. Ironically, I mean, if you're an atheist, nihilist, materialist, there's not really any reason why you should be consistent, because there's no should involved here. Okay, should is a domain of ethics, right? Philosophy, and so if there's no real universal ethical principles, then you don't have to do anything. There's no meaning in anything. Right? I'm gonna get into more of this in the next segment, but let's think about how this leads to what's called relativism. And what is relativism? Relativism is the basic philosophical presupposition of the entire modern world out of all of this revolutionary thought and atheism, which says there is no truth. Your truth is your truth, man, and my truth is my truth, man, right? And whatever floats your boat, right? But it assumes truth to say that there's no truth. So it's fundamentally self-refuting. More on this when we come back in the next segment. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm your guest host, Jay Dyer, daysanalysis.com. I was going to try to have old Sam Tripoli on, but he was a little too busy, so I'm just going to sit here and act like Sam Tripoli. Hey, what's up, I'm just kidding. I love you, Sam Tripoli. Shout out to Sam Tripoli. And if you heard me talk about that docetism, that's a shout out to your boy Theo Vaughn out there. Now, I was talking about the atheist approach to these things, and I was talking about how it leads to nihilism. And we were covering kind of as a rough outline this excellent book on nihilism. And I remember one time when I was going to a debate many years ago, and there was an atheist and a theist, and before the debate, we were all kind of in a circle, kind of talking, and we were hashing it out with the president of, I don't know, atheist, Beaver Atheist Association or whatever it was from America. And he said something like, look, the reality here is that you people who believe in God, you theists, you're just scared. You're just scared to admit that the entire universe, cosmos, ultimately is just purely meaningless. And I sat there for a minute. I said, wait a minute. I said, so if all the universe is meaningless, then ultimately your life is meaningless, right? And that dude said, yeah, sure. I don't have a problem affirming that. Yeah, why not? So what? That's what you're scared of, wussy, theist wuss. And I said, well, if your whole life is meaningless, then ultimately this debate conference thing that we're at is meaningless too, right? And he said, yes, dude. Yes, exactly. Why can't you just own up to it, wuss? And I said, well, if this whole debate conference is meaningless, then our conversation right now is meaningless, right? And he said, yes, dummy. And I said, well, if our conversation is meaningless, then aren't your sentences and arguments meaningless? And he said, why are you playing word games? Exactly. See how easy it is? This stuff is built on a house of cards. Now, if we notice that the atheist position, that the entire superstructure is built on nothing, built on a house of cards, then we can start to deconstruct this whole system as pure contradictory nonsense, right? Before we went to the break, we were talking about how claiming that nothing is true is itself a self-refuting claim, you see. I only believe in what I can determine from my senses, right? We only know what comes through 5 sense empirical data, many people will say. Really? Did sense data tell you that you only know things from sense data? No, it doesn't tell you. You can look under a rock, you can look in a test tube, you can look at a microscope. It's never going to tell you that there are only sense datum, you see, right? So that's an assumption that's not empirical. It's beyond the empirical. But the claim was claiming to claim that only sense data is what we can know. So therefore, it's fundamentally self-refuting. Now, when you start to realize this, and by the way, in the first chapter, he does the same thing that I'm doing right here. It's not that different. He makes these same kinds of arguments. And he says, all these people, by the way, who tried to enact these ideal, perfect utopias, they're missing some fundamental philosophical points here. And when you assume from the outset for your worldview that there isn't a God, that there's nothing higher, that there's just sort of matter in motion, anytime you then try to make truth claims and try to have ethical, systems or whatever, I'm gonna have a secular humanist system, right? It doesn't work. It falls apart. Why? Because you start to realize that there's no thing to build this on. There's no objective truths. It's all purely subjective, right? And so you'll hear, atheist materialists, these kinds of people. These are the people, by the way, who are indoctrinating everybody in the universities, you see, right? Now, if you're, working Sally six-pack and Bobby soccer mom, and yes, I reversed that on purpose, because everything's reversed now in our inverted world. If you're working at the factory, you may not interact with these philosopher creeps and weirdos, but I assure you, when you send your children to the universities, they are underneath creeps and weirdos for 4 years straight, at least. Okay. Trust me, I've been there. I tried to tell my parents this years ago. They didn't believe me. They were like, it's not that bad. It's not that crazy. I'm like, Boomer, you don't even know how bad it is. They are like, I can't say on air what would come up in college classes, and nobody believes you until, people film it, right? Remember these viral videos of the last several years, and people are like, college, is that crazy, right? It's beyond what you even know. So even though you may not interact with these weird, academics on the day-to-day, Sally Sixpack, I assure you that at the university, they are indoctrinating people consistently. And the first thing that they do in the praxis of indoctrination is to try to break down the existing worldview framework that people came into the class with. That's their first priority. That's the first thing that the professors do. How do I break down their existing moral framework? So the first thing that they'll try to do is indoctrinate with these kind of unchecked assumptions that I'm talking about. Like, do you really know if the Bible's true? Do you really know if there's anything beyond sense data? Right? They'll throw this stuff out there, and it sounds kind of smart, right? Oh, well, I guess science is, done with a bunch of test tubes, and there's blue liquids and bubbles in the tubes, and I guess it's really sciencey. There's a guy with a lab coat, so that must be authoritative. But that's the domain of natural science, right? That's not the domain of philosophy. That's not the domain of the bigger questions. That's the domain of the smaller questions. I remember I had a professor one time, and he wrote up on the chalkboard, we only know what sense data tells us. That was his first class. The first thing was that. It was an astronomy class. And I said, do you know that by sense data? And I kid you not, he sat there for a minute with a chalk up to his mouth, just kind of staring off into space, like space was going to give him this answer or something. I guess if you worship space, you're going to look to space, right? But he didn't have an answer, and none of those professors ever did have an answer. And that's what I'm trying to tell you, is that it's all a house of cards, you see. And it's a house of cards that's intentionally there to make your children first atheists. But atheism doesn't hold people very long, right? Atheism doesn't have a hold, really. Like it'll last for like a phase. And then the intention is to take people into darker things, you see. And you think that's crazy. Well, now, wait a minute. What did Lawrence Krauss say we are? Do you remember what Lawrence Krauss said? One of these famous atheist materialist physics dudes. He said, we're all stardust, right? We're all stardust. What does Richard Dawkins say? Richard Dawkins says, we are all merely stardust. Perhaps, in fact, we are the offspring of queer aliens, and we were placed here by queer pervert aliens, and we are the DNA offspring of these aliens, and we must then perhaps also eat people. Right, that's a logical conclusion from the Dawkins philosophy, I guess. He literally says that, by the way. He says, why don't we speculate about eating people? All right, God is irrational, but aliens are rational. You see how house of cards this is? That's what I'm trying to say. That's what I'm trying to get across, is that this superstructure of supposed science and these giant concrete buildings with statues of Darwin and people out front, it's erected on houses of cards. That doesn't mean that scientists don't discover things. I'm going to tell you more about that in a minute. Now, I was telling y'all about Lawrence Krauss talking about stardust. We are all made of stars. Now, who else said that? Oh, Aleister Crowley, by the way, said that we're all stardust. Every man is a star, right? Did you guys ever see that interview with Ben Gertzel when he was all with Joe Rogan, man? And he was like, we're all just molecules, man, and like different configurations, man, and we're nothing else but a bunch of molecules, bro. Like, and I saw this on DMT once, right? Total nonsense, right? Molecules cannot tell you anything beyond molecules, and it can't even tell you molecules, you see. All of these worldviews are pure nonsense. Now, I was talking about relativism. I was talking about how that's kind of the basic philosophy behind this revolutionary atheistic philosophy that the Jacobins, the Illuminists had, right? And it develops into these stages. You've got these stages, and it leads to its own dark kind of logic, is what I'm trying to say. So what do I mean by that? Well, every worldview, every systems, if you study philosophy or systems analysis, this kind of stuff, you'll notice that there's a certain logic that a system has. It links together and connects together, and every one of the parts relates in some way to the whole. Right? This is true of computers, right? This is true of the different components and motherboard and all this different stuff, the screen, the keys. This is true of cars, right? A car, any kind of machine. It's true of ecosystems, and it's true of humans, and it's also true of their schema or their worldview, as we call it in philosophy. That's just the view that you have of things, right? We don't have to. It doesn't really matter about the fancy philosophy words. That's not the point. The point is that everybody has a worldview, even if they know that word or not, right? They have some view about ethics, which is just right and wrong, some view of knowledge, can we know anything at all or not, and some view of reality, what exists and what doesn't exist. Now, even if you're totally agnostic, that's still a view, right? It's a view. Well, I don't know. We don't know. Nobody knows. Who knows? But no matter what your view, there's a something in humans where they, over time, always kind of live more and more consistent with their governing assumptions or their worldview. And so if those assumptions are on the theistic side, then if you continue with that view, you're going to live more and more consistently with your theistic view. If you're on that atheist or Luciferian or whatever, that darker left-hand path, you're going to live more and more consistent with that kind of view, right? Unless you change and repent or whatever. So with these two different kinds of logics or systems, there's an undergirding logic that you will follow through with, right? Which is just called being consistent. You're going to be more and more consistent over time. And that's why you'll see this darker and darker stuff with what we're seeing, with Epstein, Maxwell, that kind of stuff coming out in the news. That's just more and more degraded and degenerate versions of people living out their worldview, living out their governing assumptions of no God or I'm God, right? Apotheosis, that man is God or is his own God, right? Self-worship, that's just what idolatry is essentially worship of the self. And so it's not just the individual that lives this out. You can also see this process in cultures and in civilizations, right? Spengler, he wrote famous books, Decline of the West, where he talked about how entire civilizations kind of had this organic lifespan of a birth and, flourishing and then death. Daniel, the book of Daniel, right? He has a very similar kind of analysis to Spengler in that he saw the successive world empires, these big idolatrous empires, as these different images at different beasts, or he saw a big golden image, right, with these different sections of the image reflecting these idolatrous world empires. And of course, the last one was the Roman Empire under which Christ was born. Right? Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 9. That perspective shows us that there are cycles. That doesn't mean that all of history is purely cyclical, right? I'm not a Nietzschean. Nietzsche thought that, but there is a pattern. There's a cycle that we see in civilizations and in histories and in cultures. And when we look at the West, when we look at the post-revolutionary period and ethos of the West, what we see is this movement towards more radical nihilistic philosophies. And it started with that kind of atheistic Jacobin type of view. And it progresses over time. You get these things. So the naturalistic assumptions of, evolutionary philosophy, that replaces the Genesis account, right? Freud comes along, and Freud kind of replaces the notion of sin or violating the moral law with confession and, telling your nasty secrets to your psychiatrist, right? That replaces the older idea of confessing to God. And then you get people like Marx who replace the idea of what economics and human interaction is with class warfare in his day. And then later on, it becomes other kinds of identity warfare. It morphs into these other things. Well, eventually you get in the 20th century, the rise of postmodernism and the breakdown of all narratives, because there's a recognition that these utopian systems, these universal systems that people kind of cooked up and came up with, doesn't matter which, whether it's Marxism or whatever, they don't really work as they're classically formulated. So they logically move and morph into the next phase or stage of their alchemical development. And for the Western atheist ethos, as it adopted atheism in terms of these Jacobin people I'm talking about, it becomes more and more nihilistic. Great example again, we look at Bolshevist thinkers and philosophers, so to speak, right? We think of Trotskyites, we think of Lenin, as I mentioned, like, I want to blow up the universe, right? Who comes up with that? What? I want to blow up the universe? And it's like, well, why would you want to blow up the universe? Don't you want to exist? No, I want to fight all existence, right? I'm anti-existent, right? And that's like the most fundamental thing to war against. There was a famous author who, I think he recently passed away, Umberto Eco, and he wrote some really fascinating fiction stories that are full of a lot of esoteric symbolism and whatnot. Name of the Rose is really good. It's got like it's a creepy kind of setup there, but it's got Sean Connery, and he's there with Christian Slater as monks in the Middle Ages, right? Name of the Rose. It's not that good of a movie, but the book's really good. And Umberto Eco puts all this esoteric stuff into his books, and then he comes out with this famous essay. I can't remember, maybe it was in the New York Times or what, but there's a famous essay about meaning. Now, you remember I was talking about atheism and meaning earlier, right? Well, Eco writes this essay, and he says, look, all you fellow liberals and fellow travelers out there, he says, look, we got to fight against the real, quote, fascism. And he says, you think I mean, dudes in boots and, skull jackets or whatever, death's head type stuff. I'm not talking about Mussolini SS stuff. He says, we need to fight against the real fascism, get this, which is truth itself. Now, that took, Eco had to go through a lot of, processes of that left-hand path. And if you read his books, he's very much a left-hand path kind of person, right? Who left religion, left, I think he was Catholic, left Thomism, left all that stuff, went into Kabbalism, went into, probably satanic stuff. I don't know, right? And then he comes out of it and says, you know what I see from all this? We got a war against existence and truth itself. And he cites other philosophers, Deleuze, these different deconstructionist people. This is what you start to notice is that as we get into the 20th century, people throw off all grand narratives. Right. I'm talking about at the intellectual level. Now, on the streets, the dum-dums out there, like they think they're going to set up the perfect utopia. Yeah. But the intellectual class, they're beyond that. They moved into the nihilistic philosophy of there are no narratives that we're discovering. Narratives are all created. And since they're all created, we will create the narrative. We will create reality. This is where postmodernism actually becomes magical thinking, literally. You read Terence McKenna in his book, Food of the Gods, he has a whole section where he says that the mushroom taught me that white people all need to die and reality is made in our minds. Back after this. Be sure to support InfoWars and the products that they have. And also be sure to go to my website, Jay's Analysis. You can subscribe there. Get all the access to the archives of the lectures, the debates, philosophy, the geopolitics, the cringe comedy, all of it is there in one place. Or you can go to my YouTube channel, Jay Dyer, and also on Twitter and Instagram as well. Now, we were talking about these stages of the philosophical devolution of systems. And one of the things that Rose highlights that is something from Marxism is dialectics. And it goes back older than, Marx. It goes back to Hegel, and it goes back even to the Greeks, which is the idea of right back and forth, left, right, black, white, day and night. All these different things can be construed as dialectics. But in the socio-political sphere, we mean dialectical opposition that's controlled and manipulated. So in the Enlightenment period, we get this outbreak, and we're going to focus on the Jacobin stuff, right? The French Revolutionary thinkers. You got your Dantons, you got your Robespierres, you got these kind of guys, and Marat, right? These are more radical revolutionaries. They weren't all that radical in the French Revolution. Some of the revolutionaries were the nobility, merchant class, these kinds of people. So you get these two branches of Jacobins and Girondins. But the really radical ones are the Jacobins, and they were connected to the Illuminists, right? A lot of them had an Illuminist philosophy. That's the real Illuminati. And initially, the idea was to promote just kind of a liberalism that sparked off into the radical liberalism of the Jacobins. And this is like, the total communism stuff. These are the proto-communists back in that day. And at that point, you get the idea of, well, let's just demythologize. Let's come up with like a new calendar. Let's have an atheist calendar, atheist civic saints, all this kind of stuff. But the problem is that eventually people realize that there's no real undergirding like basis for any of this stuff that's being erected, right? So there's a progression where people start to doubt the atheist ideals, right? I mean, think about the secular humanist manifesto, this kind of stuff. There's two of those. I had a big debate with one of the premier atheists, Matt Dillahunty. You can go watch that debate on YouTube, and he's a big defender of this secular humanist thing, or the manifesto. But the problem is that eventually you realize, well, if atheistic materialism is true, right, and there's just matter, it doesn't really matter whether you follow the secular humanist manifesto. Right. And they'll say things like, well, but, it would give everybody a better life if you just followed these basic ideas. Would it? On what basis do you know what's better? And especially for other people, right? I mean, you're an atheist, you're subjectivist. It's relative, right? So who are you to decide what's better? Maybe I want to be the God Emperor, right? I want to be the Kwisatz Haderach. To use the Dune analogy, I want to just stamp out everybody and take all of y'all's women to be my harem. And who are you to tell me I shouldn't do that, right? What's true for you is true for you. Whatever floats your boat, bro. I just want to be the God Emperor, right? So you see how quickly that devolves. It doesn't work. So therefore, the secular humanist stuff is all built on sand. And eventually, the atheist materialist type people, that crowd, they kind of see through that, and it moves to the next phase, right? And the next phase of the revolution tends to be a little more vicious. It becomes more hardcore. You get the ideas of, all right, now we've got to like face the reality, right? There's no grand narratives, there's no real truth. So the elite, the power elite here, we're saying, they make truth, quite literally. We got to set up systems that will ultimately put the technocracy in. We got to get rid of a lot of people. And it's unfortunate, but it's just the way it is, right? Bertrand Russell has this quote where he says, look, a black death, right? We got to have a black death every few centuries. Why don't we have an engineered black death, which could kind of, trim the hedges, you know what I'm saying, on the human crowd, just trim those hedges a little bit down to maybe 500 million, whatever. And it sounds bad, but who cares? Ultimately, we got to commandeer evolution. We got to steer it, he says, as all of his crew said, by the way. And he literally says that, and I think it's an impact of science on society. Yeah, it is. He says, well, let's have an engineered black death, this kind of stuff. Now, that's the next phase where they've realized there's no grand narratives. We're not actually going to have this utopia. So we got to, have the noble lie, Plato's noble lie, which is like a civic religion. Auguste Comte, he talked about making up a fake religion to satisfy the masses. That's a lot of these churches are basically tools of the state, fake religions out there, fake churches. He says we can have that, but in the background, we're the scientific elite. We really know what's going on, and it's unfortunate, but we can still set up this kind of, a transhumanist technocracy or whatever. We can still set up this perfect system which will evolve to give us godhood. That's the second phase of the revolution, is this still idealistic but more realistic position than the utopian, low IQ people on the street types, or the thugs, or the the people who think that they're going to set up the Maoist perfect state or whatever. It's also a phase, right? So this next stage says, well, we got to kill everybody, put the robots in, let the bitch bots run everything. But then some people realize that even that doesn't really make any sense. And so there's a darker layer level that he argues is the real operating system of the whole Jacobin leftist left path system. And he says that's a Luciferian satanic nihilism. And he argues that, the top of that pyramid, that glowing eyeball up there, that's actually satanic, right? And that glowing eyeball has the rest of that pyramid duped into thinking that at different layers, they're going to get different shares. They're going to get different pieces of the pie. But even the highest layers of that are duped, because at that top, the I hates humanity, all of it. And it's not going to evolve you into being a robot so that you can live forever. You're not going to be downloaded into the cloud, all this nonsense, right? And by the way, isn't that like a genie in a lamp? I thought we had moved past superstition, and now we're talking about genie worldviews. Like, I'm gonna download into a zip drive. That's like a genie, dude. Imagine you could have a lamp that's a zip drive, and then if you could download into the cloud, you could literally be a genie in a lamp. Think about that. I'm joking, but for real, if we think about how this is ultimately satanic, then we realize that, oh, wait a minute. If I'm being told that we need to be post-human, evolve past all of humanity, and that all carbon-based life forms themselves got to go away so that we can have this new silicon-based life form, which is what the transhumanists teach, then maybe at a higher level, there's actually just nothing but the destruction of the human race. Did you ever think about that? What if that's really the final stage? And that's kind of where Rose goes in this book. Now, I don't think he mentions transhumanism. He might mention it in passing, because this was written a few decades ago. So he might have kind of been aware of it, mentioned it in passing. He did mention like the Illuminati and this kind of stuff in the book. He mentioned those kind of secret societies doing this kind of stuff in the background. But what I'm getting at is what you often hear, people like Alex say, which is that, look, there's higher and higher levels to this. And some of those layers of the pyramid think that they're going to get a piece of the pie. They're going to be downloaded into the zip drive or whatever. And that's also another level of deception. Remember Albert Pike said that all of the lower levels on the pyramid get deceived intentionally? Remember when he said that? You think that there's not still deception even at higher levels? I mean, I've met some, fairly prominent people who are well studied, interviewed some pretty prominent people academics, philosophers, these kinds of people. Some of them, smarter than me, really smart people. And they don't always have the full picture, right? You got to kind of get up into like a Kissinger, Brzezinski type of level before people really kind of have the big picture. That's what I'm trying to get at here. But even that is still the big picture in the human domain, right? The geopolitical domain. What I'm trying to say is there's a higher kind of spiritual reality that, Alex does talk about pretty consistently. And Rose talks about it in the same way, where he says at that highest level, the highest sort of initiation level, you could say, into the dark arts of Satanism, Luciferianism, transhumanism, is a total anti-human, anti-existence, destroy this whole reality, ultimately. That's what I think Satan ultimately wants that, right? Non-being. Because if God is the creator, author of being, what's the highest level of rebellion against creation and against God? To go against being itself, right? Anti-being. Jay Dyer from Jay's Analysis. Thank you for letting me host. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Alex Jones Show, and you can follow my stuff at jaysanalysis.com, and also my books. You get signed copies of Esoteric Hollywood 1 and 2.